Now you're very welcome along to the Huddle Breakdown, and a call here with you as always in the company of Alan Morrison and of Juco James. As always, we're going to be looking ahead to Celtic's transfer window and some of the ingoings and outgoings on this podcast, and we're also going to be looking back at Celtic's 2-0 win over Kilmarnock as they march on towards what should be a title by the end of the season, still 9 points ahead as we go into, I think it's 17 games left in the SPFL season. We also have League Cup and Scottish Cup stuff to come further down the line as well. So it's a promising couple of months for Celtic ahead, and that's what we're going to be touching on in this podcast. What I do want to do is cast an eye back on to the last podcast before we move on to the on-field action, because there was a video of a discussion point that we had about Reo Hatate on this podcast that went out on our Twitter feed that viral is probably a polite way of putting it. It went quite far and wide in the Celtic community, and there was quite a lot of abuse and vitriol that was aimed towards it, and we just wanted to address it. From my point of view, and I'll get Alan and James in on this now in a second, I was the one who put out the tweet, I was the one who does the video, and I was the one who phrased it in the manner of, is Hatate good enough? From my point of view, that's probably not the best way to phrase what the discussion point was. It was supposed to be a discussion point on Hatate's ceiling. Is he going to improve enough to be a European standard player? And the clip was, I think, 1.5 minutes long. That's all you can actually put out on Twitter unless you have a professional account now. So it's a very small snippet of the larger conversation that we had. And from my point of view, I probably didn't phrase it correctly. And that probably instigated a lot of the abuse that came our way. So that's my point of view from what went on. Alan, you were actually in the clip. It was your opinion. So I just want to get your point of view on this because it was a quiet afternoon for you.
As I recall, and I think I said it on the podcast, all I literally did was repackage what James had said in slightly different language because I didn't know the question was coming and I hadn't really prepared for it. All that being said, the serious point on Hatate is because, I hope people realize, we don't just flippantly give binary opinions on players. There's always, I hope, context and nuance to the evaluation of every player. And, I would certainly want to do a proper piece on Hatate. Now, how that turns out, I'm going to let the data and my thoughts lead me on that. All I really want to add is that, a lot of people who were dishing out abuse, I suspect never looked at the clip. I've never seen our show and probably not interested in what we do. And that's absolutely fine because this has always been, when I set up Celtic by Numbers, I always knew this was going to be a very sort of niche concern. It wasn't going to be something that I thought a lot of people or even many people would be particularly interested in. And I'm, astounded and grateful that so many of you, listen to the Huddle Breakdown. So, but all that being said, a lot of people who don't follow me or I, any of us, or the Huddle Breakdown, we're very abusive. And to be honest with you, a lot of people who, as I say, are not interested in this, and that's absolutely fine. There's the vast majority, I would imagine, of Celtic fans probably want to go to the game with their mums, their dads, their kids, whatever it is, their mates, go to the pub, watch the game, maybe come out, have a pint, talk about the football a little bit, and then go home and never think about XG or packing or all the bollocks that we talk about. And that is absolutely fine. No problem at all. I don't expect them to be interested. I don't expect them to care what my or anyone's opinion is on Hatate. That's no problem. The only issue I have is that there were a small number of purportedly Celtic supporting accounts who've got a lot of followers that initiate these pylons. And most disappointing was the fact that there were a number of Celtic blogs and podcasters who, as far as I was concerned, we always had a cordial or even no relationship with, who probably have never watched this show, who were more than happy to use their influence to make that pylon worse. So to the people that were abusing, as I say, I understand that, I get it, no problem. But for those few individuals who have responsibility because of the number of followers they have and because of the voice they have within the Celtic community, there was some absolutely appalling behaviour. I don't know where it came from, but I'm hoping that they'll kind of reflect on that. And that's really all I want to say.
Yeah, and just a final note from me. One thing that was definitely thrown at us was the clickbaity nature, or trying to do these mad opinions just to get clicks and to earn money. I would say to those people that you should probably do some research into podcasts and how much money there is to be made from these, because I can tell you this with a straight heart, that there's absolutely no money to be made from running a Celtic podcast. This is something that we do in our spare time because we enjoy it. James, do you want to add a final point before we move on? Because I'm sure people want to hear about the game and about Celtic rather than us.
Yeah, not much. I actually, you touched upon the one thing I was going to put is it's the, you know, I have a little bit more experience than you two with the Twitter mob. And so it's the intent aspect that is probably my pet peeve, meaning that, you know, to your point, Enda, the idea that I think, and you've explained it this way, I think you made a good faith mistake in how you characterized it. You know, it was reasonable that a lot of people didn't take the time to put it in context. I mean, why would they? So when things go viral like that, to the extent it did, people are just going to look at it quickly and, you know, whatever. But the idea that you do this for clickbait, I mean, we're like the opposite of clickbait. You have to be a total dork to sit through most of the crap that we put out, as Alan said. And, you know, there's been a couple of things because they're very, you know, relative to common narratives, a little bit heterodox. So they tend to get more traction. The two, you know, if we were clickbaiting, if you were into clickbait, and the only two that I can remember were you know, Alan, I don't know what's up with you. It tends to be what you do, not me. Was the John Joe Kenny and Ralston comparison that we did back,
which was a kind of humorous skit, actually.
Exactly. Yeah, it was more so, you know, maybe, you know, John Joe Kenny wasn't the worst fullback in the history of the universe. And Ralston's probably better than a lot of people thought. And then this one, you know, that's it. Those are the two that have kind of gone a little bit crazy. You know, so I was more aggravated at the people that impugned Alan's character and intent and yours, Enda's, because I'm kind of used to it. So yeah, we're just here to have fun, share our opinions. You know, the one thing I did say, and I did a little thread on, I mean, the other part that aggravates me is there's almost like a troglodyte underpinning to it, meaning that the idea that Alan has spent literally thousands of hours capturing this data and reviewing game data and game footage doesn't accumulate some knowledge and insight that other people don't have, including Enda and I, is, you know, ridiculous. So it doesn't, and Alan would be the first person I think to say it. It doesn't make him better or superior or anything like that. It's an issue of being informed and having a different perspective. That's the point. That's why we do the show, is to try and bring a different perspective. Doesn't mean that we're always right. Doesn't mean that other people's analysis or opinions are invalid or unworthy of consideration. I mean, it's, you know, so that's kind of the broader context that I came at it from. You know, so I agree with that. I mean, the vast majority of people, I think, were just responding, and you know, that's not a big deal to me. That's your fault.
So it's all my fault. I will take 90% of the blame for this, because I did mischaracterize it, not purposely, but I mean, I've been working a day job. My brain was mushed. I tried to come up with a headline that would be interesting to people, and turned out it was.
We still love you, Enda, don't worry.
That's okay. Let's move on to the game at the weekend. Celtic won 2-0, and in the greatest irony of all ironies, Reo Hatate was man of the match.
Oh no, it was better than that, right? So Celtic were trolling us. That's how famous and big we are, right? Celtic actually were trolling us. They had Reo Hatate as the image on the team lineup, and then he was the stadium man of the match, and it was just brilliant. I mean, I was laughing out loud. I was laughing. It was funny.
It was amazing stuff. Yeah. And then obviously you have the little shimmy video that goes viral, Reo Hatate as well, from the weekend, which again, as you said, he's a man of beautiful moments, and he produced a couple of beautiful moments at the weekend.
He had a great game.
Which we're not going to complain about, by the way. We're not going to complain about. So this game, 2-0, to Celtic. Jota with the opener, Kyogo with the second. Celtic had about 4 or 5 different chances in the game. Giakoumakis actually hit the crossbar twice in the second half. We'll start with the starting lineup because there was a couple of changes made to this team. Bernabe came in at left back. Moy started in the middle for O'Reilly. As we said in the podcast last week, it looked like he was a little bit physically and emotionally drained. So nice to see him get a rest when it was possible. And Jota came in on the right wing for Abada. The first thing that I want to throw to you, Alan, is just the consistency of the lineup this year.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually quite impressive to another extent to what Celtic are doing, that they're currently 9 points clear at the top of the table. And I can't remember when we last had a consistent lineup that there wasn't something wrong with somebody at some point.
No, and I think we've been certainly less prone to injury this season than last. So let's get that on the table for a start. So last season and actually the season before, horrendous season, under Lennon, many things went wrong for Neil Lennon, some of his own making and many not. And let's be very fair about that. Injuries were certainly one of those things. Last season, we were in a position where we were trying to integrate a lot of new players. We're trying to integrate a very different way of playing, a very different way of not just playing, but more importantly, a different way of training. And that's crucial because the training is 90% of the week's effort, and playing for most players, for half the team, it's like 60 minutes. It's 60 minutes of running around and a bit of warm up and a bit of warm down. But the training is like the 9 to 5 job, Monday to Friday, etc. So the difference into the training probably had a massive impact on Celtic, and so the number of injuries were huge. And then obviously the manager was trying to sort out from a squad that he inherited versus the players he brought in, who are the ones that I want, who are the ones that I trust. And we ended up last season in a situation where we were really, from January to the end of the season, we only used really 17 players. That's a really small group of players that were there were others that came in and played the odd minute, but it was 17 players that played the bulk of those minutes. And that obviously started to have a bad impact on some individuals. We saw Turnbull break down, we saw Kyogo break down, for example. So this season, it's very much more, Postecoglou's squad. There's only really probably, and off the top of my head, Bain, Taylor, McGregor, Forrest, I think there's Welsh maybe, that there aren't Postecoglou signings that are really part of the first team. That's actually quite a small number of people. So the rest of the squad are people who he has inherited. He's bought. And I know there's a few anomalies in there. Scales, McCarthy probably being the most obvious ones in terms of, I think the club were trying to do him a favour in bolstering up the numbers at that point. But long story short, he's had his own squad. And actually this season, if you look at it, and I did a little bit of analysis on this, we're averaging about nearly 4 lineup changes for every single game. Now that's a lot. I mean, 2.4, 2.5 is about the league average. So 3.8 is high. Now, a lot of that was during the Champions League campaign, and a lot of jiggling went around those matches. You saw habitually 4 or 5 changes between a Champions League game and the next game. And even in the last couple of games, we've had 3 changes each, and that's really been due to new players coming in and players either being injured and what have you. So there's no one reason for this, but we have made a lot of changes. And I think you're right, Enda, to say that we haven't had that continuity. But what I would say is we've at least had a team that the manager wanted to pick with the players that he wanted. And he's had a much wider set of players that he is comfortable and confident in to play. So, we've got 5 wingers essentially, so you can rotate those. We've got like 4 number 8s that we can pretty much rotate. We've got 4 centre halves that we can rotate, and we've got two fullbacks in each position, etc. So, and so we've got 2 strikers. So there's enough bodies there that are players that the manager trusts that we can rotate. I think we've done that really well, and is what I'm saying as a summary. And that obviously, especially in the league, clearly we've only dropped whatever it is 5 points, whilst maintaining a rotation and without burning anybody out. No one's got burnt by being overplayed. So I think hitherto and where we are today, that's a success. And I think we'll come on to talk about the January transfer window. I think that will only continue.
Well, as Mickey Beale said during the week, he continues on his absolute
Mickey
rampage
Ricky.
of media interviews. Ange got lucky, because he spent a lot of money and he's been able to bring in a lot of players.
Aye.
Don't let facts get in the way of a good story. But James, the question about this is for you is because I know you spoke a lot about injuries, especially soft tissue injuries and things like that last season. Do you look at this as a positive that we have the players that can come in and still get results, or would you lean towards more of a consistent lineup because of the consistency that it brings in player relationships on the pitch to the system that they're supposed to be playing and aspects like that?
Yeah, I think there's a balance to strike. So there's always positives and negatives with these things. So I think what our ability to continue to perform at what's, as far as what we can tell, I mean, that we don't have, some of the metrics going back much further than 14, 15 at kind of the earliest. But so this does incorporate the invincible side. So that's kind of the creme de la creme of the modern era, let's call it the data era. And that this team is performing at that level. And that's that team did not have anywhere near the competition from Rangers that this team does. Meaning, I think Rangers were like 20% of our wage bill that season. They had just, achieved promotion. So it really is extraordinary how well this team is performing, and the fact that we're able to do it with all of these changes. I think that speaks to. I'll start with the positive side. I think the positive is how dominant this iteration of Celtic is under Ange, deploying his way of playing against our domestic competition. It's just remarkable. I think what it also probably suggests is that, with some small exceptions, there's not a lot, as I call it, idiosyncratic, right? So this is one of the things I've been saying, is that you can kind of plug and play most of our players in the lineup, and then domestically we're going to continue to dominate kind of at the levels that we are. And obviously there's degrees of that, if you went completely wholesale and brought up some of the guys from the B team, you know what I mean? So there's some limitations to this, but, no matter whether it's Abada, Forrest, Maeda, Jota, Haksabanovic, there's a certain degree of dominance I think we're going to achieve just because of some of these structural issues. So that's, when you're talking about winning the league and dominating domestically, there's huge value to that. That makes us incredibly difficult to overcome as the best team in the league. So Mickey's got a tough job on his hands as a result of that. And as we continue to increase quality of depth and maybe add a little bit of idiosyncratic player talent, then I think that's where you start to get that next jump up, which is okay now. And again, back to the context of how we open the show, one of the things that I'm focused on almost all the time these days is, okay, how do we, get to that next level in Europe? Because, and this is purely from an analytics dork perspective. It's not all of that intellectually stimulating for me anyway to analyze how we beat Kilmarnock 2-0, or the 10th time that we beat Motherwell 4-0, right? So particularly under Ange, these are, I joke, it's almost like Billy Madison playing dodgeball in first grade, right? So there's a degree of dominance here that's makes the details, the minutia of analyzing it, not all that intellectually stimulating for me. Other people are different. Again, this is my personal preference. So what I've
James, let's get to your year 2 or 3 of walking it before we go that far.
Right. So, and that's one of my problems is I think, probably too much ahead. And that's, so that's where I've been focused on is, okay, how do we get to that next level in Europe? Right. Because that's a really hard analytical challenge. There's a lot of room for debate and discussion about that kind of topic. So that's the context that discussions like Hatate come about, and you know, a lot of different things, whether Ange Ball will translate with our wage bill playing in the Champions League, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's I yeah, and I think that the game this past weekend was a perfect example of that, is because, I mean, how many times do we have to see Derek McInnes line up man versus man against a Celtic team at Celtic Park that they completely run out of gas after 50 minutes and get, you know, leave acres of space wide open in the second half, right? I mean, I've seen this movie how many times now, and the guy keeps doing it. So, you know, there's only so many times, you know, I'm not doubting how Derek McInnes is going to line up now. So there's not a whole lot of like shocking revelations to be had from an analytical perspective. You know, with the Kilmarnock managed by Derek McInnes.
Well, this will come into our conversation about the transfer window, but Celtic already have the advantage of being a very well-funded club because of the years and years of success in the transfer window and turnover of players and things like that. But we're now seeing a well-planned Celtic strategy within the transfer market that is going to make Celtic a very difficult club to contest against. Even if you're Rangers, even if you're Aberdeen or Hibs, compared to the rest of the league, I think Celtic are a really dangerous animal in Ange's hands at the minute, because it's a well-funded, well-planned club. That the sky is really the limit. Domestically, I think Celtic are going to be quite dominant for a long time. It is about that step up to the next level. But we'll keep focused on the Kilmarnock game just for the time being, James. I won't hold you on it too long, because it was another start for Alistair Johnston at right back, Alan, and he's coming in. He's going to be Juranovic's replacement. I think everyone has kind of come to terms with that. What are you seeing that you're liking from him?
Yeah, so I think you know, I take James's point, but and actually, you know, hit the nail on the head in terms of where some of our comments come from is like, you know, what do we? There's not a lot of interesting things to say about dominating Motherwell, but you know, you were trying to think, well, how will this player perform at the higher level? That's really where some of this comes from. But coming back to the Kilmarnock game, Alistair Johnston just in the door. You know, he signed after the World Cup. He had a bedding in period, so he was ready to be pitched in at Ibrox on the 2nd of January, playing in quite an orthodox right back role in that game. And in that game, if you look at how he performed, he actually, I believe he had, if you look at StatsBomb, and James likes the on-ball value metric, he had the highest on-ball value passing metric in the game at Ibrox of any player on either side. And that was whilst playing a very orthodox right-back role. And by orthodox, I mean he didn't invert a lot, he didn't overlap a lot, he pretty much stayed in his lane, if you like, in his station. He also had James Forrest in front of him, and you know, James worked hard. He actually played some interesting passes, especially infield, but he didn't really affect the game in the final third or get beyond his man as a wide player. So we were quite solid in that sense, and actually we also restricted Barisic to creating one chance. Now, Barisic and Tavernier are by far their most creative players, and most of the danger came from the other side, from the right-hand side. So with Johnston in that game, not only was he, I would say, efficient and effective, which sounds like damning with faint praise. It's not meant to be. He also was effective because he avoided danger. It's the absence of danger on that side that was a very telling about his contribution. Now let's go to the Kilmarnock game. We saw a very different performance from Alistair Johnston. So again, in both games against the Rangers at Ibrox and against Kilmarnock, he didn't have a direct wing opponent against him. The Rangers played a very narrow front three and tried to funnel Celtic wide. Kilmarnock played with a back five, a sort of three in midfield, and then a one, and then a one. Robinson essentially was sacrificed to man Mark McGregor, and then they had a striker. So he didn't have a direct opponent against Kilmarnock, and the Kilmarnock left wing back Krasin essentially is a defensive player, was never really going to challenge him defensively. So defensively, it was a very easy game for him. But so what he did was he tried to affect the game through his movement. And if you look at his heat map from that game, it's quite extraordinary in terms of he pops up on the left wing, wide left, inside left, centre midfield, outside the box, all sorts of positions that were just weird and wacky. Now, what was also interesting was the fact that he never tried to do anything extravagant, let's call it, on the ball. He wasn't trying the killer pass. Now, on the other side, we had young Bernabei. Now, Bernabei is a player who's equally fascinating, but for different ways. And the pass that Bernabei provided to Maeda to set up that opening goal was a thing of absolute wonder, because he literally took out the whole team with that pass. Right, so we talk about packing. If you want to know what packing means, right, Bernabei took out 9 players with that pass to Maeda, who then rolled it across the box, and either Kyogo or Jota would have had a tap in. So he also gave the ball away a tremendous number of times. But on the right hand side, we had Johnston. Now Johnston didn't ever even try the sort of pass that Bernabei attempted to create that goal. Nor did he try and take shots from 30 yards, even though he was often in position to do so. So he was much safer with the ball in what he was doing. But what I think he was doing was he was trying to move the Kilmarnock players out of position. He was trying to take up positions to create overloads and to create moments where Celtic would have a numerical advantage in dangerous areas of the pitch. Very intelligent. So he wasn't giving the ball away a lot, but he was trying to influence the shape of the game and trying to bend them out of shape with his movement. I thought it was a tremendously intelligent performance. And in both games, what I also like, and where I think he's I'm already calling it as an upgrade on Ralston and Juranovic, he's just his sheer physicality. He's just strong. He's got a good core. He's bigger. He's 5'11". He's got a confidence about his physicality. So I talk about physical intelligence. He knows how to hit somebody such that they get unbalanced and he stays balanced. That's the hockey. I mean, James will talk about this with more authority, but that's the hockey training. To know how to hit somebody so that you keep your balance and they don't. And he's got that. And so that physicality, that will make Celtic stronger in Europe defensively. Now, what I don't know, and I think we'll wait to see what happens, is whether he can affect the game at a higher level offensively. What I loved was his movement, his intent, his unselfishness. He didn't look like he was going to take a lot of chances himself. He was going to be safe in possession. But as I say, he did try and move them out of shape, and I really like that. So positive for sure. And I think defensively, I'm going to call it as a bit of an upgrade. I know that's a small amount of data, but a very interesting player.
On the physicality element, I think even just looking at him in comparison to Ralston and Juranovic, I know all the footballers at the club are going to be, gym rats and physical and athletic, but I think you can even just see in his arms and his chest that he's an absolute rock. If you even just have a look at the picture in the thumbnail of this video, you can see his sort of biceps bursting out of the jersey and things like that. He does look like a real specimen in terms of his build and his ability that way. And on his movement, just one thing on that, because Celtic did score. It was from Jota. He crossed the ball into Kyogo, who scored. It was disallowed for offside. If you look at the Kilmarnock defence, before Moy played the ball over the top, Jota was a mile offside, but they're incredibly narrow and there's so much space for Jota out the right-hand side, and that comes from Johnston making a run inside, and the whole defensive structure of Kilmarnock just shifted over towards the right back situation, creating loads of space for Jota. So glad you picked up on that as well.
No, and there's just one thing I want to, for balance, is that, there's a thing, he's just playing for Celtic. He's only played 2 games. He's a young guy. Does he have the confidence to take responsibility? And this is one of the points about coming back to Hatate, is that, O'Reilly has shown he can take responsibility. Maeda is now taking responsibility. Hatate took responsibility on Saturday, but that was quite a new thing for him, to have that confidence to take responsibility. Celtic had a massive issue on Saturday, whatever day it was, in that they were even more left dominant than they normally are. and the right side was almost an oasis, and Jota never got on the ball, and Johnston and Jota weren't really connecting, and so that aspect of it shows that he's still got a long way to go, because basically the first half was the story of Starfelt passing to Burnaby, passing to Hatate, passing to Starfelt, passing to Burnaby, and on and on it went. And that was the story of the first half, and it was awful. And we just didn't get anywhere. We needed to vary it. We needed to exploit that sort of movement. And of course, as James said, they got tired. The spaces opened, and we did the job that a squad of our size and ability should do against that opponent. But that would be the other thing I would call out in terms of balancing what I've just said about Johnston is, can he see that we are being that left side dominant? Can he then grab that game by the scruff of the neck and start to get Jota involved in the game and start to punish them on the right hand side as well as the left?
Yeah. There's a comment in from Bondi Got Game. Loving the stream, 5 a.m. here in Sydney. Worth it. I don't think we are worth it, but thank you very much for tuning in at that time in the morning. Glad to have you. James, one word on Johnston, and then I want to ask you about Maeda as well, because he's in incredible form at the minute, and I'm interested to get your opinion on whether that is a hot streak that comes from confidence from the World Cup, in your opinion, or is that sort of a leveling out of a consistent player who's been doing a lot of the good things and they just weren't really working out for him previously?
Yeah, I'll just say something quick on Johnston and address your Maeda question. So the other thing I'll mention is, in this era of helicopter parenting, as they call, I don't know if they call it that over in the UK, but yeah. So you've had kids that starting at a really young age focus on one sport more and more in the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years. And there's actually a fair amount of research that's coming out about cross-sport athletes and how they have, spatial intelligence that's superior to the ones that grow up just playing one sport. And the reason I mention that, relative to Alan's comment on Johnston and his movement and his spatial intelligence, doesn't surprise me. He's a former hockey player, right? So growing up playing hockey, you get some of those kinds of diverse experiences in playing a different sport that, again, I was never anywhere near any of these levels, but I played 5 different sports growing up. And, you learn different things from different sports and physicality and movement and how all these things kind of, interplay. So I just thought I'd mention that. With Maeda, yeah, I think, obviously confidence is important, and it's impossible to kind of quantify something like that. I don't think it can hurt. I think probably the biggest thing that shifted might be perception of him because of the World Cup. Narrative might have tweaked a little bit. I think he's playing roughly the same. And he's had a couple of things come off, and maybe that is partly due to confidence. Who knows? Like, that kind of thing's impossible to know. But yeah, I mean, I'm just happy to see the narrative kind of swing back on him, because again, he's the kind of player that is really, really good at a few things, and he works his tail off. And I think, that there's definitely a place for him, even in Europe, I think, because of, that skill set that he has. And I think he did show that at the World Cup and some of the success, Japan had in pressing, that kind of thing. So yeah, he's just a fun guy to watch too. I mean, that's just the non-analytical part of it. So yeah.
James, sorry, can I just butt in there? I'm going to disagree with you here, because I do think he has his confidence with him. I think he now accepts his place in the team as being someone who feels that they've got the authority to influence the game. I've just very quickly looked. His expected scoring contribution up to November before the World Cup has doubled in the matches since. And I know it's a small sample, it's only 5 games, but it's doubled. And I mean, when have we ever seen Maeda run from the halfway line like he did against Hibernian and then take that shot on? I've never even seen that before. It's confidence. I do think he's had an enormous adrenaline shot of confidence. I don't want to get in. I'm very nervous about getting into sort of racial stereotypes about the Japanese players, and so apologies if I stray into any territory that people may find offensive. But what I learned from reading about the Japanese players was around the sort of hierarchy within dressing rooms, around the senior pros, etc. And there's it's probably not, if you look at Kyogo's the senior pro amongst the Japanese players in our dressing room. No one would ever question Kyogo's personal responsibility that he puts into his performance and his willingness to push himself in a way that and the League Cup final being the perfect example of that. He physically dragged that team, to victory in a cup final at Hampden, even though he was probably on the verge of breaking down with injury. Now, one of my criticisms, one of my observations about Hatate is a young player, is he probably hasn't felt that authority. Matt O'Reilly did. He comes from a different culture, a different mindset, if you like. I think Maeda now feels he has the authority to be more assertive in his play. And I think that's what we're seeing now. I'm sorry if that offends anybody or if that's oversimplifying it, but I'm just trying to give some kind of cultural context to what we're seeing. And I think Hatate's got that in him. I think Hatate's got that growth in him to also take that responsibility as well. I think it's maybe something he'll grow into. But I think we're seeing that with Maeda, and it's brilliant because we want players to feel that they've got that mandate to take ownership for their performance and to really push themselves and say, right, you know what, I'm going to take this shot on. I'm going to burst into that space. Because what Maeda was doing against Kilmarnock was he was doing what Jota has been doing over the last year, which is he was up against the lad Mayo, who I think big, strong defender, young player, and he went at him again and again. Now Mayo won a lot of those battles, but Maeda never gave up, and he kept going again. And we haven't seen that. Oh, do you know what? You beat me there, but I'm going to go again. I'm going to hit the ball past you. I'm going to go again because I'm going to back myself. And I don't think we've seen that so much from Maeda, and I think that was brilliant. And I just hope that continues.
Yeah, and I think it's the end product from him as much as anything over the last couple of weeks that we're now seeing potential. I think the perception of Maeda was someone who worked. Nobody ever questioned his work ambition or his work ability and his pressing, and never really giving up in the game and pressing the full game forward. But I think it was the end product and getting the ball into the box that might have frustrated people in the past. Whereas now, in the last two games at least, we're seeing, for example, the cross that went in for Jota's goal. It was absolutely brilliant. There was a couple of crosses in last week's game as well that went straight across the 6-yard box that nobody was able to get onto. And I think that's probably what's changing the perception of how he's playing, and hopefully it continues, because if he keeps putting the ball into the right place, then Kyogo, Jota, Haksabanovic, or whoever, they're going to be on it. So I think it's brilliant that he's playing this well and that the fans are starting to get behind him as well. A comment in from Ian Fleming. It's a super chat, so I just want to say thank you for that. He says, hi guys, looking forward to the cup game after the Saturday result. Pretty confident of getting a result. Thanks very much. And then Paul Dayet, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, rightly points out, who said that there's no money in Celtic podcasts, Enda. So I like that one. Let's move on to the transfer window, because there's a lot of transfer chat going on at the minute. Some potential outgoings. The rumor is that Juranovic is going to Monza in the Serie A. Monza currently sitting in 15th. £7 million is the rumored fee for that deal. It's not confirmed, but that would be a 4.5 million profit if that were to go through. Giakoumakis, no shortage of suitors for Giakoumakis apparently, but the leaders in this race, according to the people involved in these transfer rumors, is URA Red Diamonds, who are said to be in with a £8 million deal for Juranovic. That would be, or Giakoumakis, sorry, that would be a £6 million profit for him. And then Stephen Welsh is rumoured to be out the door at Celtic to God knows who at this point. Udinese wanted him, Toulouse wanted him before as well. So, but Celtic are apparently open to offers for Stephen Welsh in this transfer window, which would make sense given the signing of Iwata, who is a midfielder, but is, Ange has said that he can play multiple positions, and Kobayashi as well coming in as a centre back. Jens also has an option to make his loan deal permanent at the end of the season. So it would probably make sense that Stephen Welsh would leave Celtic in this window. And then incoming is Gusung Cho, who is coming in from Korean outfit Jeonbuk Hyundai Motors, whose technical director is former Manchester United player Ji-sung Park. So he wants around £3 million to £6 million for the South Korean striker. So a lot going on in the world of Celtic. We'll start with the Juranovic one, because that's the one that's been going on for a long time. Celtic already have the replacement in the door, And I want to know from you guys, is that the reason that the fee and the ambition of the club he's going to is lower than we might have expected? Or is there some sort of clause here that we don't know about?
I'll question your premise. I think it's too early to tell. I think, we're at that point where until a deal is actually closed, who leaks what to the media and what their motives are in order to try to negotiate things, I think is highly suspect. So, I mean, it's kind of fun to speculate and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, until we see the actual destination, what I would say is that the reporting has been pretty good, that it seems like both are very likely to go. And if you just kind of, again, the fact that Johnston was a early acquisition in the window suggests that was probably in the pipeline and well known at the club. I would be my guess, although who knows, but I think that would be a reasonable speculation. So yeah, what I will say is that the transfer market is slowly getting more efficient, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, which is the demographic of player value is shifting down. And this was predictable, I would argue, because of what's taken place in other sports that have started to kind of ascend the analytics curve. So, both of those players are older within kind of the modern analytical construct, right? So once you get up into that 27, 28 range, the likelihood that they're going to have really any appreciable sale on value after acquisition means that you're basically just looking at, okay, what performance am I going to get out of this player and what am I willing to pay for it, right? So that means, that's different than if you're buying someone who's 21 and you think, oh, in 3 or 4 years I can sell them for 20 million, right? That's different than buying Juranovic at 27 and saying, okay, probably in a year or two his value might even be lower than he is now. So I know it's not exciting, but thinking about things in terms of net present value calculations, that kind of thing is what the smarter clubs are starting to do in thinking about how they're doing a better job at player trading models. So that's why when I wrote some stuff back in August, it was like, if you can get 10 to 15 million for either one of these guys, that's a big number probably as the markets are developing. And as I've said this before, I think it's also worthwhile to consider who the counterparty is. So, I've said before about smart buyers, i.e. Brentford bought Ayer. Normally when you're talking about two parties, it's the old saying, if you're at the poker table and you can't identify who the sucker is, it's probably yourself. And I've been in that situation more than once in my life. Toulouse is a smart buyer. So the fact that they're interested in Welsh, the fact that Alan and I have, I think, agreed that he's got a lot of specific aspects to his play that maybe could be really beneficial in a league that's not as aerial as Scotland, for example. So I think counterparty is important. So I think, the Japanese club going after Giakoumakis, from what I've looked at, they're not all that smart as far as how they're run. They're more of a throwback club. So if we can, sell for a bigger number to so-called dumb money, that's usually a good thing. Whereas if your counterparty is a smarter club, then, maybe you can tilt the odds as far as who's getting the better deal in kind of the value proposition. So my hope is that both of them go to teams that aren't as smart. That would be, to me, indicative that we're getting a better value in whatever Chelsea. The market is going to afford.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, Alan. I'm not an expert in any of this, and there's far more thinking in these transfers than the average fan will probably give credit to. But on face value, in the summer, Juranovic was linked with Chelsea. He was linked with Atletico Madrid, and he went on in the winter to play pretty much every game for Croatia at the World Cup, who got to the semi-final. He played in the semi-final, and he played quite well at the World Cup. I just don't see the thinking behind this now being a mid-table Serie A club coming in with a £7 million deal for him, even though he is 28. He has 4 years left in his contract. Celtic hold the bargaining chips at the table. I just don't. It doesn't make sense to me, really.
No, I'm not sure there is a lot of sense in that. Agents and other parties play a lot of silly games, frankly. So, I don't know what to make of that. I think, as you said, there was a lot of seriously large clubs and seriously stupid clubs. As I say, I mentioned Chelsea, Barcelona, another stupid club, linked with him. So that, let's wait and see. I mean, what I would say is that there was no plan, as I understood it, to buy another right back. Therefore, the fact that we bought Johnston was out with planning for this window, which means he will be going. It's a question of time, and we just need to play it out. The fact that Johnston started at Ibrox and started at home to Kilmarnock, and just not a complicated person when it comes to things like this, tells you everything you need to know about where we stand. And Juranovic at the moment is basically playing the Ralston role. He's the backup to Johnston until Ralston is fit, because he's got 1 foot out the door, and that's how that plays out. We don't know. With Stephen Welsh, I think it's simply a case of, I believe the manager likes him. He sees a player in him, but obviously Welsh is, what is he now, 23 years old, and clearly he's got his own ambitions, and he's not playing. Starfelt and Carter Vickers are the preferred option. A new centre back, which was always on the cards, was brought in during the window, who's specifically a left-sided centre back, and I think it's just simply a case of one of those situations where the player wants to be playing football, and fair play to him. And I hope he actually goes somewhere where he's going to be like a Toulouse, where he's probably going to be nurtured. And I think Stephen Welsh in a non-aerially dominant league, I think will be a really intelligent and a really good centre half, and I hope he becomes Scotland's centre half for years to come. So that's just one of those sort of parting of the ways, I think, that happens in football. Giakoumakis, I think, again, it's a lot of it is agent driven. The guy's 28 years old. He was seen to have a good season last season. Now that Kyogo's fully fit, James might disagree with fully, but he's fit and playing, and he's clearly the first choice. My understanding was that we wanted to bring in another forward to make 3 forwards, because obviously the way Kyogo plays, the intensity he plays at, the number of times he gets kicked up in the air, we can't guarantee he's going to see out a season. Giakoumakis is a great squad player to have every time he's come in. I think he's been very effective. He's great for the system that we play. But again, he's 28 years old. In terms of his own personal capital, based on the back of last season, if you look at it from an agent perspective, SPFL joint top scorer, scored a goal in the Champions League, etc., he probably feels slightly undervalued. I think he's on about 11 grand a week. They probably feel they can get perhaps double that somewhere, to be honest with you. A Turkey or a Greece or somewhere like that. It might be a club that will literally double your wages. Which one of us who's either on this podcast or watching wouldn't listen to that kind of offer? You'd be lying to yourself if you didn't at least look at it. So, listen, again, that might be one of those situations. And as Ange's always said, don't get too fond of these players, because we need to start up trading. And if we're going to up trade, then if we get good money for a 20-year-old squad player that isn't mission critical, I'm kind of okay with that. Not that I'm not fond of these players, but it's business. At the end of the day, it's business, and Celtic are in the business of building a Champions League team. That's the reality of it. And to do that, you're going to have to be really ruthless. You're going to have to up the volume of trade, and you're going to have to up the revenue that you get from trade to be able to afford the players that you need to upskill at that level. So I think it'll happen, but because there's just too much noise to think otherwise. How much we'll get from again, I don't know. I think there's a little bit of trading to go in this transfer window for sure.
Mm-hmm. Paul Andrew Martin says that Anthony Joseph agrees that the Monza thing is a no-go. I think Anthony Joseph is quite a strong source when it comes to things, so I tend to to lean heavily on what he would say about this. Tony Cassidy also with the update from Fabrizio today on the incoming or supposed incoming replacement for Giakoumakis, and that is South Korea's Cho Gun-sung. He has 3 proposals on the table according to Fabrizio Romano. Celtic have made a 3 million bid with 50% on future sale up to 6 million, while Minnesota in the MLS have made an offer of 5 million plus 30% on future sales. So a bit of competition there. Mines are apparently in for him as well, but he would be Giakoumakis' replacement because he looks like a big physical striker essentially. Have either of you looked at him?
So just quickly on that one. So like I say, my understanding was we were going to bring in a third striker anyway. So if Giakoumakis leaves and Cho comes in, don't rule out there being another striker to come in the door. And that might be more of a project type player. Now, the interest in Cho started before the World Cup. Now, again, it's easy to we look at Celtic and you look at transfer dealings, you can decide if things don't go the way the supporters want it, who's to blame, and we throw blame at people, right? That was always a risky strategy because Cho was clearly going to play in the World Cup. Nobody knew how that was going to go. Okay, so Celtic had in principle a deal agreed before the World Cup. He played in the World Cup. He did very well, and suddenly the parameters changed. That's football. That's just life. Okay, and so the fact is that this transfer, if you think about this transfer in relation to all the other transfers that Celtic have undertaken in the since Ange was in the door, they've generally been done very quietly and very quickly. Well, as far as we know, right? There's probably lots of things that go on behind the scenes. This transfer has dragged on and on and on and on and on. So 2 things on that. One is the fact that we're still interested tells you a lot because, Ange would walk away from a deal if it wasn't somebody that you could look in the eyes and say, you want to play here, etc. So the fact that we're still in the game after all that's gone on, it's dragged on literally for months now. It tells you that Celtic are really keen on this guy. But on the other hand, we have to be prepared to walk away if it isn't a deal to Celtic's advantage. We just have to accept that these things do happen.
Yeah, and he could be a potential bad influence in the dressing room, Alan, because
a Rangers player,
Chinese players don't get on with Korean players, so that means Kyogo, Maeda, Hatate, they're not going to get on with them.
I saw a Chinese takeaway in Glasgow once. I don't know if I told you that.
Yeah,
you'll hate it.
If you haven't seen, if you don't know what I'm referencing, just look it up on Twitter because it's a hilarious clip from.
If you think we're bad,
guys on the other side doing. So, James, have you looked at Cho in terms of his demographic and what he's going to bring?
I have not yet, no. So I have absolutely nothing to offer on that regard.
I'm pretty sure people have. So if you want to go and look for some info on him, I'm pretty sure he is similar enough to Giakoumakis in that he's a big physical presence and a box presence striker as opposed to all over the place, sort of like Kyogo. So
yeah, I can add 2 conceptual things. The first thing is I think it's interesting to note who else is in on him, and the ascension of the MLS into more global relevance in the transfer market is kind of just breaking out the last couple of years. So I suspect that is going to be an increasing issue for teams like Celtic as far as from a financial resource perspective, meaning that Minnesota is by far, they're not exactly a top financially resourced MLS club. So if we're competing with them, I think that gives you an idea. I mean, the likes of LAFC and even Atlanta, and there are some teams that will spend even more money. So that's going to be an issue going forward. My point is, it's just getting more competitive. So we have to be even smarter than we otherwise would be because of that competition. The other thing is that, and again, this is going to go over as I joke, like a wet fart at Christmas dinner. I think this whole how they did it, the World Cup thing, is a pretty big cultural issue relative to player value. I mean, I'm not saying there's no impact to, I'm not saying about perception. Like there will still be, again, those dumb money participants in the transfer market that are still there. Like, the ones mentioned, Atletico, Barcelona, Chelsea, they have not been the best clubs as far as doing their transfer business. And where a person's born and or where their parents or grandparents were born is a huge part of that. Meaning that's determined who they're going to play for. And it's a couple of games. It's a few games, and the transferability of that and just kind of normal variance. I mean, so again, is it worth considering in how you're evaluating a player? Of course it is. But the idea that you're going to take someone like Juranovic, who's been a professional for 7 years now, 7 seasons, and distill his value down to a few games in the World Cup is just kind of silly. So again, you don't disregard it, but relative to the weighting of like how good this player is and what they're actually worth, I think it's much smaller than it probably should be much smaller, and that smarter clubs would probably approach it that way.
Yeah, I agree to an extent, because I know that scouts know about these players and watch these players all the time, regardless of what they're playing in. But in the same way that the Champions League is a shop window, the World Cup is also a shop window that comes around. And I think the perception of it is based in a large chunk of reality, is that people will look at the Juranovic situation, where he's playing in Scotland week in, week out, dominating as a right back, top right back in the country. And they'll say, okay, but it's only Scotland. What can he do at a higher level? And then you get the Champions League, you get the World Cup. The same thing happened to Christopher Ayer, he's Norwegian. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Norwegian, yep. Yeah. So the Norwegian under-23 manager said that he wasn't getting challenged enough at club level to warrant a call up to the Norwegian under-23 squad. So I think that's where the perception of the World Cup being a market for smaller clubs, I use the term small with a strong accent for Celtic. Celtic are a huge club, but they're playing in a smaller league. So I don't think it's a shop window for bigger clubs like Man United or Real Madrid or whatever. They're not looking for players, but players like Juranovic, who play in the Scottish League, going to the World Cup and playing alongside better players at a higher level, I think that's when it does actually, hold some water when it comes to the transfer value.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think my point is more so it probably holds more than it should for some parties.
Okay.
So when I'm relatively weighting what it would be, I think it's probably overstated. I mean, of course, weight how he did in the Champions League, how he did in Europa League, how he did in all the how he did at Croatia and all these other tournaments, right? So you've got all of this information, and to say, hey, it was just these 4 games or 5 games, or I forget how many they ended up playing, but that's more my broader point.
Mm-hmm. So Enda, just on Cho then. So it's one more thing I wanted to add is that I follow this. I say analyst, but he calls himself a philosopher. He's a Dutch guy called Joost van der Lee, and he works.
Yeah. I've come across his work
amongst others. Right. So, I've got listen. I am totally agnostic. I don't have a view as to the efficacy, accuracy. This guy has built, in partnership with others, I guess, a football behavioural model which completely rejects expected goals as a viable metric. Use Bayesian statistical theory, which James can explain to us far better than I, because I'm not a statistician, to come up with a method to come up with a concept of essentially replacement value, and replacement value from the perspective of both parties. So Celtic sell Juranovic. Celtic have got Juranovic. How much would it cost Celtic to replace Juranovic with a player of equal ability? Now, because Celtic play in a much lower value league, it will cost less than it would a Chelsea to replace an Azpilicueta, let's say, right? And then if you sell Juranovic to Chelsea, how much would it cost on the day that Juranovic walks in the door as now a Chelsea player? What's the replacement value to Chelsea of buying another Juranovic, right? So this is the, and I've oversimplified this probably quite a lot, and it's very interesting, the model, and I retweet some of his stuff when he talks about Celtic players, because I just find it interesting. I'm not agreeing, disagreeing, or whatever. I just find it interesting. His particular take on Cho was that Cho was a player that it would cost around about 3 million for his Hyundai Motors club to replace. but it would cost, if Celtic were to buy a player of his ability, it would cost Celtic around 13.5 million to buy a player of that ability. Therefore, he's hugely undervalued, and therefore it would be a terrific piece of business were Celtic to buy this player. Now, if it was me and I was in charge of Celtic recruitment, I would take that information and I would probably take at least 2 more different methodologies and sources for evaluating player value based on different models, different methodologies, and I would look across of those sort of things. But anyway, I just throw that in. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's or what have you. Interested in James's thoughts on it, but especially. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, I've seen his stuff. I've looked at it a little bit. I love the heterodox, especially when it comes to analytics, because when you chop off the tails, you get the conformity. Everyone's doing the same thing, and then in the tails you get the total whack.
Right? It's interesting.
Yeah, you get the total whack jobs that are out of their minds, and you get those that are actually onto something that's really cool and brilliant. And I haven't decided on what he's doing yet.
No,
it is very interesting. Yeah, not that I'm some grand poobah of determining these things by any means, but yeah, I haven't quite gotten my arms around what he's doing.
No.
And that's just part of it is I just haven't put the time into it, and part of it is I can't find, I don't know where's the degree with which he's documented in white papers and that kind of thing. So there's a sliding scale of my interest and tolerance for digging on, but it's definitely interesting. Like the idea that he's coming at it from a nonconformist perspective is really fascinating.
Yep.
So yeah,
agreed.
I don't follow him, but I see his work regularly, and I always pay attention out of curiosity more than anything else.
I'll give my opinion. I think it's total bollocks, to be honest. He clearly puts a lot of work into it, and that's fine. And he wants to do it. That's completely fine. But I think the problem with this outside of the box thinking is that nobody in football thinks like this. So he's completely intellectualized.
He literally works for football clubs, unlike us.
But I fully believe he's over intellectualizing things that football clubs
there's a good point.
do not do. Because there are so many people in football, and whether we enjoy it or we don't enjoy it, and I know you guys want more clubs to become more modernized when it comes to the use of data. There are so many clubs in the world at the highest possible level that don't do it. And I think he's over intellectualizing something that the football clubs themselves aren't considering. I know he does work for certain football clubs that might do it, but the majority of football clubs aren't doing what he's doing, in my belief. I'm not behind the closed doors. They might be, but I believe there's far more people who are football people who look at things from a linear perspective. Is he a good player? Is he a good lad? Okay, what's he worth? Can we afford him? And that's the thinking that goes into football transfers, in my personal opinion, but I could be wrong.
I was just saying that's right, and so I'm with you. I hear what you're saying, but actually, I know we're running out of time, right? But you touched on something which I've been thinking about, which is the over intellectualization of football. You might think this is rich, possibly coming from me. Not that I would ever claim to be an intellectual, but I think there's an interesting debate to be had about the over intellectualization of football analysis, because it's something I see. I mean, I do follow a lot of people that do this sort of stuff, and I sort of think, wow, it's like at the end of the day, it's a game of football.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is. It's quite ironic that we are talking about this, because I would say a lot of people think that we're over intellectualizing football. But the reason, and you guys have, the original concept of this was 2 stats guys and 1 football guy, and let's throw them all together into a pot to see how it works, and it might come up with some quirky opinions here and there. But you guys have sort of brought me over to the world of stats, and I believe most football clubs do rely on this data, rely heavily on GPS data, rely heavily on underlying numbers when it comes to monitoring performance. A large amount of it is probably scientific based in terms of injuries and things like that, but I believe it has a place in the world of football, whereas there are certain things where I just like, just give it a rest. Like it's they scored a lovely goal. Can we not just talk about that?
For the vast majority of people, this is why I don't even get into the 99% of this stuff. Like, so this is why I say people conflate stats with analytics. Yep, right? Yep. Conversations about Bayesian statistics versus non-Bayesian, or whether a system is ergodic or non-ergodic, right? The vast majority of people have never even heard of those terms. and nor should they, right? Unless it's absolutely, part of their profession or their hobbyists in some sort. So, the just because you have a number and a bunch of numbers, it's like if numbers and stats were all it was, every accountant would be a billionaire, right? So there's a level of work that needs to be done that's analytics driven, that's completely different. And that's why we don't even talk about that degree, because it's boring as shit to almost everybody unless you're into that kind of stuff. It'd be like talking to my wife about biochemistry or T cells versus B cells. I have zero interest in it. Why would I? It's a level. She's a doctor, by the way. So it's like, forget about it. So yeah, but depending on who's doing the analytic, like if you're doing the analytics at a big club, those are the kind of questions you probably should be open to at least being able to be conversant about. It's not just about XG. It's like, because otherwise this is the inherent problem with analytics, is there's all kinds of problems with data quality and modeling. Modeling is inherently garbage in, garbage out. So these people that just take models and apply them as if everything's linear, everything's mean regressing, everything's all this other stuff. That's not how the world actually works. That's why you get the global financial crisis in 2008, because a lot of these very supposedly smart people follow really bad models.
If we can leave one term.
Sorry, can I just jump in? Mick Nolan 88, 3 non-Scottish people talking about Scottish football. Why do people keep thinking I'm not Scottish? I was born in Falkirk, so sod off with that. I'm 100% Scottish.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it's not really. I didn't know whether to address that or not. What I was going to say, just to finish off, if we can leave one football phrase or football analytics phrase in 2022, I want it to be scanning, because that is creeping into the vocabulary and vernacular of people, and it's bollocks. It is absolute bollocks to analyze someone's analyzing on the pitch, because every fucking footballer scans. Everybody does it from a young age. You were taught, look before the ball comes to you, what are your options, and adjust your body shape accordingly. It's a very simple thing. Yes, there are players that do it better than others, but for God's sake, I just want to leave that in 2022, because that's the biggest load of nonsense that started creeping into football analysis, in my opinion. I think that's where we'll park it. An hour, 7 minutes. I think that's probably long enough for a Celtic podcast by 3 guys that a lot of the internet hated last week. So, Alan, James, anything to add before we finish up?
I'm done.
No, I'm good. Yeah.
Lovely stuff. Thanks very much to everybody who watched and who listened. And if you want to get the podcast, it is available in the usual places: Spotify, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And very kind words as well in the comments as well. We didn't address the situation to get kind comments, but we do appreciate them regardless, and we appreciate everybody who watches and listens every week, whether you agree, disagree, like or dislike us. We really do appreciate it as well. So that is the huddle breakdown for this week. We'll be back again with another analysis of Celtic against Kilmarnock, this time in the Scottish League Cup. So until then, we'll chat to you later. Good luck.